But they say they're set up for the movie, so at least they can handle that. Go!
Alright, so Mr. Gene Kranz was born in Toledo, Iowa. He graduated from St. Louis University with an aeronautical degree. After school, he joined the United States Air Force Reserve and took a tour in South Korea, where he received also a commission as a second lieutenant. Before working for NASA, he worked for McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Corporation, assisting with missile research and testing. When he joined NASA, some of his more prominent roles were assistant flight director for two Mercury flights, and he was also assistant flight director for the first 3 Gemini flights. In 1965, Mr. Gene Kranz received his first flight director role in Gemini 4. He was the flight director for many missions, including Apollo 11 and Apollo 13, and his last mission was Apollo 17. In 1974, he was promoted to Deputy Director for Mission Operations, and in 1983, he was promoted to Director for Mission Operations, and then he retired in 1994. So if everyone could give Mr. Kranz a nice round of applause.
Seeing the guys in the hot seat to do the introduction. But I was fortunate that when I was going through high school, in fact, well before high school, at the time I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, and my father died when I was 7. So my mother had 2 kids plus myself, 3 of us to raise. This was during the Depression with no insurance, no money around the house, etc. She opened up a boarding house. And in the process of doing this, we had all the soldiers, sailor, and airmen that lived basically at our place as I was growing up. And we generally have about 3 to 4 military personnel, and then we'd get all the rest of us squeezed into one room, sometimes 2 if we were lucky. But it was there as a result of my association with these warriors that I developed absolutely a passion for aviation, a passion for flying. And that became my driving force. As early as I could move out on the roads, I used to hitchhike over to Cleveland for the air races, and then I had an accident over there and went up to Detroit for the air races. So that aviation was my passion, and that was the key that drove me to a small college in East St. Louis, Illinois. It was part of St. Louis University, called Parks Air College. And Parks Air College was a truly unique entity at that time. There were about 5 aviation colleges that specialized in aviation within the United States. And they were very, very competitive. You had Spartan Aviation was one, Parks was another, 2 or 3 others, and they had a Hilliard that was down there. And but basically, in the process of doing this, the whole objective was to teach people to fly. So they actually provided the pilots for the airlines. And to a great extent, military services. Park graduated a large number of people during World War II that would fly the fighters and bombers over there. And basically, I went to Parks, class loads were very high there. We generally averaged about between 23 and 26 semester hours per semester. And we worked in the trimester system. So basically, that allowed us to get out in 3 years. In the process of doing that, however, the requirements for graduation was you get your degree, or aeronautical engineering degree. I got my aircraft and power plants license, so I became a licensed maintainer of aircraft, and I got my first 10 hours flying time. So it was the background I had when I left college. I went into the Air Force and was very fortunate to go through a pilot training down at Spence Air Base, where I met several incredible individuals who pretty much provided the steering I needed. A young guy getting in, just in the military, going through flying training. A guy by the name of Jack Coleman, and Jack Coleman was basically the individual who taught you to fly that you never forget. But in particular, in the process of learning to fly, he taught you basically to move right to the boundary of the performance of the aircraft and your own performance, and look over the edge and basically accept that as a great way to live. And that provided the background I needed when I went into jet training. And then finally, in those days, Top Gun school, they didn't have such a thing then, but it was really the fighter weapons school at the Nellis Air Force Base. Went through and started flying the first of the major subsonic fighters. I flew the F-80 out there, flew the F-86. And so I had the opportunity to fly the early subsonic fighter aircraft. And then I moved into the F-100 Super Sabre, which is the first aircraft that could exceed the speed of sound in level flight. I had a bunch of 86 time at this time, so basically they retreaded me, sent me over to Korea with a 86 squadron over there. Came back stateside and I was looking for my next direction. I felt I wanted to move into aircraft flight test. I wanted to continue this process of growing. And I was fortunate to get a slot in flight testing of the early jet bombers, the B-47 and B-52. And spent several hundred hours in the business, and it was an interesting test program. The B-52, basically it was relatively new in the production line. We were going through adapting various weapons systems through it. We dropped various shapes out of the bomb bay, see how they'd free fall. We put ducts, tufts all through the bomb bay and to back airflows in there and take high-speed photography. We did a lot of work in the air-launched missiles in that area, and we also did a lot of work in the decoys. But as I was wrapping up, as we were wrapping up that program, I saw an advertisement in Aviation Week that indicated that they were forming a space task group, and I thought, gee, that's pretty cool. I sort of like the idea, and the words, the exact words, space task group to determine the feasibility of putting an American in space. And I thought, gee, they don't even know they can put him in there yet. They were looking to see if it's feasible. And basically sent in the standard government form 52. About 6 weeks later, I got a call. They said, are you interested in joining up? And I said, yep. And about 3 weeks later, I was at Langley Research Center. And basically I went into a pool of other engineers that were there, because they still hadn't figured out how this organization was going to work. Some people were going to go to engineering, some down to the Cape for launch operations, some into trajectory design, some in flight operations, some in launch operations, and pretty soon a guy comes along after about 2 weeks in there, taps me in the shoulder and says, I'm Chris Kraft, you're working for me now. And then he said something very interesting. He says, I want you to go to the Cape, write a countdown, write some mission rules, and when you're through, give me a call and we'll come down and launch. 2 weeks in the job. And that is basically how this thing works. So in the process, I had the opportunity to really learn the business of space, basically from the ground up, but also learn it from what I would say was the master of spaceflight operations at that time, or the man who would be the master of spaceflight operations, Christopher Columbus Kraft. So then let's fast forward a bit, and I'll give you a bit more of the history, but I'll do it in a slightly different format. You know, when Jim Lovell called down from the spacecraft, hey Houston, we got a problem. All I had was my team in mission control, this exact room, and a learning curve that started about 10 years earlier at a place called Cape Canaveral. At that time, the Cape was nothing but sand, marsh, salt grass, corrugated steel buildings, and antennas. When I was there, we learned of leadership, trust, values, and it was there that we became a team. Mission control, this room is a marvelous leadership laboratory where we teach our young controllers to achieve excellence as an individual, as a team member, and as a leader. And here we learn the difference between the I and the we part of the team, because when their time comes, we need our controllers to step forward, assume a leadership role, make their contribution, and then when they're through, return to the ranks within the team. Our work develops chemistry, because chemistry in any organization is a force amplifier. It amplifies the individual's talent as well as the team's talent. And chemistry leads to communication in this room that is virtually intuitive, because we must know when the person next to us needs help, or a few more seconds to come up with an answer. And in mission control, there's no such thing as a first team, because once we launch, every team must be capable of accomplishing the mission. And finally, when we must act alone, and in this room, we know that time will come to each of us. We are never alone, because we know our team stands with us. In our line of work, failure is not an option. When we started in 1960, our world was vastly different. Our nation would soon be torn by the beginning of the conflict in Vietnam. During that decade, we would see 3 political assassinations. And the civil rights movement was just emerging within the nation. The Cold War with the Soviet Union provided the stimulus for the space program that guided every aspect of America's foreign policy. Computers existed only in laboratories. There were no global communications, and in that decade, American students would riot on the campuses. And then in 1961, a young, brash, and articulate President John F. Kennedy issued a challenge. He said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard." And when he issued this challenge, we were struggling to put a spacecraft in orbit. 1 month prior to that speech, we had blown up our second Atlas rocket. 9 days prior to the speech, we had launched Alan Shepard. We had a total of 20 minutes manned spaceflight experience. We'd never been to orbit, and we were challenged to go to the moon. So engineers and people experienced in flight tests, and a small group of 31 Canadians and Englishmen from the Crackerjack Avro Aero flight test team joined with the Mercury 7 astronauts at Langley Field in Virginia to form a space task group that would win supremacy in space. Our boss was Walt Williams. Walt was the toughest man I have ever known. He is a brawler. He is more fitted to working as a longshoreman in New York or New Orleans or San Diego than leading the American space program. But in the business of aircraft flight tests, Williams was a legend. He was the pioneer director of the NACA high-speed test station that today we call Edwards Air Force Base. And he's a project manager for the X-1 rocket ship that in 1947 took Chuck Yeager and the world into the age of supersonic flight. Williams' deputy was prophetically named Christopher Columbus Kraft. Chris was the pioneer. This control center is rightly named for him. He developed the concept of spaceflight operation, directed the implementation of the worldwide tracking network, launched each one of the Mercury missions. But the most important thing was he was the mentor, the teacher, the tutor for the first generation of young people that became known as mission controllers. Mercury Control did not have a single computer. There were 3 mainframe computers supporting all of Project Mercury. 2 of these mainframes were located 700 miles north of the Cape at Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, and they were the first fully transistorized computers. They were located up there because IBM did not trust us to operate these machines. On the island of Bermuda, we put a reliable vacuum tube computer with a small team of 7 controllers. We always launched eastward over the island of Bermuda, such that if we lost communications with our crew during powered flight, the team in place would tell the astronauts what to do when the engines shut down. Global communications consisted of a 60-word per minute teletype network that dated back to the days of America's Pony Express. So after a couple weeks training in spacecraft systems and operations, and after we all became very proficient in Morse code, because Morse code was our backup form of communication within the ground tracking network and the crew on board the spacecraft. So after we achieved this proficiency, that was a #1 capability we had to teach our young kids. We sent young men to 13 tracking stations around the world. They went into the heart of Africa. They went to Zanzibar. They went to Australia, ships at sea, islands of the Pacific. And the risk to these young people was very high. They were all your age. The risk was high because the 60s was the end of the European colonial period, and most of these countries were in a state of civil war. My controllers in Africa, the Kano, Nigeria tracking station, were twice rescued by the Nigerian army. At Zanzibar, we would work under the protection of the Gordon Highlanders and the Queen's Royal Rifles regiments up there. They would surround the tracking station during contact periods, bring the controllers back to the quarters at the end of the ship. Station gunners at the top of the stairs became so violent at that site that we shut it down after only 3 years. But these young folks at these sites were eyes, their ears, and voice as the spacecraft passed overhead. And for their age, they were given incredible responsibilities. Now, we first went into space in Project Mercury, and each one of our launches was a chapter in the history book of spaceflight. Our mistakes were violent, they were brutal, they were visible. 2 of our first 3 Atlas rockets exploded shortly after they left the launch pad. Then we launched our first Redstone rocket. We sent the firing command, the engine ignited, lifted forces off the launch pad, then it shut down. Through some miracle, the rocket landed back upright in the launch stand without exploding. The escape tower fired. It went up to about 4,000 feet, came plummeting down at the viewing stand, and the senators and congressmen ran for cover. Our rocket engineers were speaking in German. We didn't understand what they're saying. We literally did not know what to do. But we were fortunate in those days because our nation understood there is no achievement without risk. And there certainly weren't any guarantees in this new business we call spaceflight. We put 6 Americans in space in our first 2 years, and there were close calls in every one of those missions, especially in John Glenn's and Scotty Carpenter's. But we got every one of our crewmen home. By the time that we had finished with Project Mercury, we had learned that man could live and could perform in space, but we learned much more. We learned of leaders and leadership. Leaders have integrity. They're teachers, they're team builders, they're great listeners, and when there's trouble, leaders are out front. And we also learned a lot about ourselves as individuals because many of us came in from aircraft like this, and our ego was much bigger than this room. And it was tough at times to get people to work together. But we knew that success would only come as a team, so we became one. And we learned to check our ego at the door every day when we came to work. So we moved into the Gemini program, and Gemini was designed to develop and test and prove the technologies that we needed in order to go to the moon. One of these technologies related to the tools and the techniques we used in designing our mission trajectories. For trajectory design in Project Mercury, we had a very large group of women. There were about 100 of them. They were all mathematicians, and we called these women computers. Computers were people to us in the early days, not machines. And these women would travel this from the headquarters at Langley Field in Virginia down to the Cape for each one of the launches, and they'd bring their calculators along. They'd get down to the Cape, they'd punch away at the numbers, they'd write the answers down, they would plot it in graph paper, and these women would do this endlessly day after day just to design a single Mercury trajectory. Well, this approach wasn't going to get us to the moon. It wouldn't even get 2 spacecrafts rendezvous in Gemini, so we finally did get computers, and each one of these machines was as big as a house. 5 of them filled the entire first floor in a new mission control center in Houston. And even put a small 4,000-word computer on board the Gemini spacecraft. But the problem was we had no computer experience. So we went to the colleges and universities throughout our nation and brought in the young people who were working with computers in laboratories. We went to the Army Missile Command at Fort Bliss in Texas because the Army had been working with computers in the ground-air missile program, and we basically hired the corporals and sergeants there as discharged. And we took these new recruits and merged them with the Mercury veterans, and we started working in the very edge of all knowledge, all technology, and all experience. Now, when we first started off in space, the Soviet Union had about a 2.5-year lead on us. But when Ed White stepped outside the spacecraft in the Gemini 4 mission, we had now narrowed that lead down to mere months. And then, on the next 2 missions, for the first time, we set American manned spaceflight records. First for mission duration, and then we rendezvous 2 spacecrafts. And when we had accomplished this rendezvous, we had developed the technologies needed to reach further into space. We had the confidence to use these new technologies. But we continued to learn of ourselves and of our work. We learned of discipline, of focus so intense upon the objective that we would never do anything personally in this room that would compromise achieving that objective. We also found the value of high morale because we now knew we were succeeding because of our beliefs in our mission, our team, and in ourselves. So we moved into Apollo. We were in this room Friday afternoon, January 27th, 1967, 1 month from launch, testing the Apollo Command and Service Module. Crew members were Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. We had worked with Gus and Ed in the Mercury and the Gemini program. And Roger was a Navy rookie preparing for his first space flight, but he was already pretty well known within our ranks because he is one of the Navy pilots who took the pictures over Cuba during the missile crisis. Test that Friday hadn't been going very well. We had problems with communications, we had problems with life support. Crew reported noxious odor inside the spacecraft. Test procedures just didn't hang together. So all through that afternoon, we'd call a halt in the countdown, sort out the problems, continue on for another 10 to 15 minutes, and then shut down again, get everything squared away. Till finally at 6:27 that afternoon, again we shut down the countdown to sort out a problem before we transferred from external power on the launch pad to to internal power in the spacecraft. And 4 minutes after entering that countdown hold, we were startled by screams coming from our crew. And we listened to our crew's screams and we watched them die on our televisions. And with their death came anger. Anger at ourselves because we knew we were responsible for America's first space disaster. We wrote 2 more words into our vocabulary as mission controllers: tough and competent. Tough meaning we will never again shirk from our responsibilities because we are forever accountable for what we do, or in the case of Apollo 1 and our crew, what we failed to do. Competent. We'll never again take anything for granted. We will never stop learning. From now on, the teams in mission control will be perfect. And we designed the badge, the emblem of the mission control, the price for admission to our ranks, which were this badge: discipline, morale, toughness, confidence, commitment, teamwork. Because as a team, we must never fail. Now, in our line of work, the boss is the flight director, sits right up that console in the center of the room. And he has probably the simplest job description in all of America today because it's only 1 sentence long. It says, the flight director may take any actions necessary for crew safety and mission success. That's it. During the course of the mission, he is the ultimate authority. And the flight director is supported by a team of between 15 and 21 controllers, people specialize in trajectories, spacecraft systems. You have operations, you have planners, procedures writers. You have a medical doctor who looks after the ground team as well as the crew in space, and we have an astronaut who provides communication during the course of the mission. And mission controllers are young. They're generally in their early to the mid-20s, and flight directors are in their early to the mid-30s. And again in this room, on July 20th, 1969, a team of young Americans whose average age was 26 is the team that took Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and the world to the surface of the moon, and we literally fought every step of the way to get there. When we finally shut the engine down on the lunar surface that day, we had less than 17 seconds of fuel remaining, and we were counting down to a very difficult and extremely risky land abort decision. Well, when we shut that engine down and the crew walked on the surface and they lifted off and we got those guys back home, we had fulfilled the pledge that we had made to our now dead president, John F. Kennedy. We launched again in November, Apollo 12, and as we left the launch pad, we were hit twice by lightning. In an electrically dead spacecraft thundering up towards orbit, the only thing working was booster propulsion and booster guidance. Mission control had 2 minutes to save that mission. We voiced the instructions up to the crew to find a very obscure switch that would restore our backup telemetry. With the telemetry online, the team could get to work. We verified reactants were flowing to the fuel cells. We brought the fuel cells back online in the power system. We secured the navigation system. Everything kept working, got the crew up in orbit. Checked the spacecraft out, and we wrote the checklist in here in a fly to do the checkout after that lightning strike. And then 2.5 hours later, we give the crew the go for translunar injection. So by the time we got to Apollo 13, this was our 3rd lunar landing mission. The 2 prior missions had been pretty sporty, and we were hoping for a change. This mission would go a lot smoother for us. I should have known better because our liftoff time in Houston was 13:13 Central Standard Time. Okay, Central Daylight Time, excuse me. When our crew members were Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Ken Mattingly. Lovell and Hayes were the crew in the lunar module. And they're scheduled to descend to a very rugged landing site on the moon that we called Mara. Ken Mattingly was the command module pilot. He'd remained circling the moon as the mothership. But 2 days prior to the mission, Mattingly was scrubbed from the mission because he had been exposed to measles, and he was replaced by Jack Swigert, a member of the backup crew. The mission's run in trust. When you turn a Saturn loose from this room with 7.5 million pounds of thrust, that is commitment. There's no changing your mind, no turning back from that decision. And trust allows you to make the split-second decisions very rapidly, seek out every option that may exist. We lost an engine during the 2nd stage of powered flight. Very quickly, we looked at the remaining 4 engines. They were all go. We computed the new engine shutdown times, verified we had enough propellant to get up in orbit, passed this information up to the crew. Everything kept working, got them up in orbit. And 2.5 hours later, we give the crew the go for translunar injection. So now by the end of the second day, this crew is 200,000 miles from Earth. They're 50,000 miles from the surface of the moon. And we're entering a phase of the mission, we use the term entering the lunar sphere of influence. And this is the point in the mission where you cross over from the Earth's gravity to the moon's gravity. And during that 4-hour period, you have 2 mission abort options if you decide you want to change the mission and come home. One comes around the front side of the moon, takes a day and a half to return to Earth. The other one goes completely around the moon, takes between 4 and 5 days to get back home. But you got to make up your mind quick because time is running out. My team was on the console. During my shift, we had a television broadcast from the crew, and during the broadcast, the crew's wives and families had been sitting behind me in the viewing room back there. When we secured the television link, families went home, and now in my main control room, the noise level was building up because the next team of controllers had reported in for shift handover. Their flight director, who is Glenn Delaney, is the leader of the black team, and we used colors to identify teams in those days, is sitting next to me at the console reading my log. The final thing my team had to do is to put the crew to sleep. We have a 5-page pre-sleep checklist we go through very carefully to make sure everything's properly configured in the spacecraft before we give the go to start the sleep period. We got down to the final entry, and this final entry asks a question: do we require a cryo stir? Now the fuels we use on board the spacecraft are cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen, super dense, super cold liquid packed in vacuum insulated tanks at incredibly low temperatures of -300 and -400 degrees Fahrenheit. Cryogenics react with a catalyst in a fuel cell to produce electricity, and as a byproduct they produce heat in pure water. So this is the energy, heat, and water resource we need to go to the moon, operate the vicinity of the moon, and return to Earth, so they're enormously important. 2 days into the mission, however, I've used some of the cryogenics. Now, if I could look inside the tank right now, I would see a 2-phase condition, part liquid, part gas. And this results in unequal areas of pressure within that spherical tank. So it's very difficult to manage. Pressure is going into the fuel cells, into the life support system. So the designers put fans inside the tank we would turn on to stir this mixture up. And we had a heater that we used to raise the pressure. That's what a cryo stir was all about. Fans on, heater on. Jack Swigert in the command module acknowledged our request for the stir. And you look behind him, and coming through the tunnel from the lunar module was Fred Hayes. Swigert then threw 2 switches. Now nothing happened for 16 seconds. And then inside oxygen tank 2, a spark jumps between the fan and the heater assembly, and the pressure in that tank rises very rapidly over the next 6 seconds until it blows the dome of the tank off. When the dome of the tank came off, the insulation surrounding it caught fire. And fed by the oxygen, it was like a blowtorch racing through the bay of the spacecraft, tearing out the instrumentation and the plumbing and the electrical systems. Shocking valves closed until the pressure increased to the point where it blew the side of the spacecraft off. When the side came off the spacecraft, the area surrounding it was enveloped in a cloud of debris from the explosion and frozen particles of oxygen. Now, we did not know an explosion had occurred. It's 55 hours, 55 minutes, and 4 seconds from launch. My voice loop has come alive. Hey, Flake, we've had a computer restart. Other controller says, and down from the space club a call, Houston, we got a problem. Well, I already had a bunch of problems reported. I was wondering which one he was talking about. My controllers at that instant didn't know what to believe because none of their data made sense. The crew thought they had been hit by a meteor. And then we see the spacecraft start to tumble, so Lovell has to take over manual attitude control so he can keep communicating with us. And for 60 seconds, the voice loops are literally chaotic with all the reports coming into me. And then the training kicked in. The controllers started working a problem. He started voicing instructions to the crew to restore some of the lost functions. So by 3 minutes, we're starting the process of recovery, but all of the problems that remain fall upon a single controller by the name of Cy Labergott. He's a CSM Econ. And he has the systems responsibility for those things you need to stay alive in space. Power, oxygen, pressure, heat, water. But I can't work with Cy because his tumbling motion has momentarily overcome our ability to control it. And now we're starting to drive towards a condition we call gimbal lock. If they get into this gimbal lock condition, we're going to tumble our gyros. We lose our ability to point the spacecraft, communicate, perform maneuvers, find our way back to Earth. If we get in the gimbal lock condition, we're literally going to be lost in space until we can go through the time-consuming and very complex process of reordering our navigation system. And you're becoming increasingly desperate, you're working in the blind, and you still don't have a clue what happened. Plus 15 minutes, Lovell's looking outside the hatch window and says, "Hey, Houston, I see some kind of a gaseous substance out there. I believe we are venting our oxygen." All of a sudden, the pieces fit together. There had been an explosion on board the spacecraft with enormous amount of collateral damage. When I debriefed my controllers after the mission, they described their feeling at that instant as if they were just tumbling into a void. I was a fighter pilot. Fighter pilots in my day used the term looking into the eyes of a tiger. And this is the stark and the very lonely feeling that you get when the only thought on your mind is survival and you're trying to find some way out of the box you're in. Well, I was a flight director. It was my job to get going. Call my controllers and say, "Okay, flight controllers, settle down. Quit your guessing, let's start working this problem. Electrical bus A is still good, don't do anything to screw it up. The lunar module is attached. We're going to use that as our lifeboat. Now get me some backup people in here and get me more computing and communications resources." Plus 20 minutes. My boss, Chris Kraft, comes in just as we're starting a series of emergency power downs. We're trying to buy some time. And Liebergott comes to me and he says, "Flight, I'd like to shut down fuel cells 1 and 3. And I say, "Si, we better think about that a bit more." And he says, "No, Flight, I think that's the only way we're going to stop these leaks." And they say, "Si, are you ready for your final option?" He says, "Yeah, Flight, it can never be restarted." And very reluctantly, I agree. Time to shut down the fuel cells. We voiced this information up to Lovell. The discussion with Jim is very short, very intense, and very reluctantly he proceeds shutting down the fuel cells. And this is probably the lowest point in morale in the entire mission, because now we know there's no more going to the moon. We also know it's going to be damn tough, maybe impossible, to bring the crew of 13 home. Not through with decisions yet, because I have to pick the return path. If I jettison the lunar module and use my big engine, I can be home in a day and a half. But some gut feeling, I don't have any data, says don't use that engine, it won't work. The other option, I'm going to have to go completely around the moon. It's going to take between 4 and 5 days to get back home. But to the best of my knowledge, I only have enough electric power for 2 people for 2 days. So with nothing but this gut feeling, I make the decision to swing this mission around the moon. I say, "Okay, our flight controllers, listen up. Be advised that all mission planning from now on will be around the moon. We will not, I repeat, we will not execute a direct abort." And this comes as a shock to many of the controllers because they believe this is the wrong decision. But they also know it is decision time, and they are the ones that must implement it. Plus 1 hour. My team has finally accomplished handover to Lenny's team, and he's immediately challenged because the 3rd fuel cell is now failing, and the lifetime in that cell is down to less than 15 minutes, so he scrambles the crew over to the lunar module to complete the power-up. But most importantly, he has to transfer the navigation data from the command module computer, which is going to die, and put it over in the lunar module computer. We didn't have a data bus transfer capability. All those computations were that are pencil and paper and slide rule. And they all fall upon the guidance officer. They must be perfect the first time. While Glenn's doing that, I'm walking downstairs to where my Tiger team is forming up. Actually, it's in the room directly across the hall and right below it. So it normally takes days and weeks, and we're going to be working outside all known design and test boundaries in the spacecraft. And I walk into that room, it's crowded, noisy, smoky, a lot of confusion because many of the controllers just came in from the rest period. And go to the blackboard and start listing the problems we expect to see. Our batteries may freeze, water system may freeze, propellant may freeze, large number of survival issues. How do we navigate? How do we get back through the Earth's atmosphere? And when we finally finish this long list of must-dos, I'll give the team their direction. We've never lost an American in space, and we sure as hell ain't going to lose one now. This crew's coming home. You got to believe it, your team must believe it, and we must make it happen. And from that moment forward, and over the next 4 days, the teams in mission control pulled off a miracle, bringing the crew of Apollo 13 home. It's now 2 hours after the explosion, and we now focus on the three most immediate problems: power, navigation, return trip time. John Aaron, 26-year-old engineer, sitting again now at the CSM Econ Console, is given the job to get us back home and the resources that are in the lunar module. John stands up at the meeting and says, "Okay, flight, I got that job, but two things we got to do immediately." And I say, "Okay, John, what are they?" He says, "Well, we got to cut a day off the return journey." I say, "Okay, John, I'll work on that part of it. What's the other one?" He says, "Well, what we got to do is we got to power down the navigation system, computer, and displays." And I say, "John, that one's not in the cards." And he says, "Why, flight, that is the biggest power user on the entire spacecraft." And I say, "John, we normally navigate with stars, but with this debris cloud surrounding the spacecraft, we no longer can see stars. All we can clearly identify is the sun, the earth, and the moon." So Phil Schaffer, another one of my engineers from the Flight Dynamics Council, gets the job to come up with new ways to navigate using only the sun, the earth, and the moon. He has to develop these procedures, prove they're going to work in the simulators, and we've got to voice them up to the crew in the next 18 hours before the spacecraft passes behind the moon. I take a third part of my team to figure out a way to get us home a day early, and the basic approach is this. As the spacecraft passes behind the moon's gravity is going to pull us in an arc and orient our velocity vector back towards Earth. The proper place on that arc, I'm going to ignite the engine that we would have used to land on the moon with, only this time I'm going to use it to increase our forward velocity by roughly about 1,000 feet per second. Means had the crew perform a very small maneuver. At the conclusion of this maneuver, the crew is now coming back to Earth. We have a ground rule very similar to the military: no man left behind. So the crew's coming back to Earth. It's going to be too late, but at least we've added some finality into the mission. We now have our first press conference because the media believes the crew is lost. At the conclusion of the press conference, they're given the opportunity to go into that room over in the left-hand corner over there. And we pump in all of the voice communications, everything that's going on in the room. We provided some display capability up there, so we're literally living in a fishbowl. Everything that we are saying and everything that we are doing is being reported live to the world as it is happening. It's now 10 hours. The team is handed over one more time. Window's Maroon team now has the helm. Things have settled down to the point where you got plenty of time to talk to the crew. And we're going through the events leading up to and after the explosion, trying to figure out what on board the damaged spacecraft will be useful in coming up with our return plans. Plus 24 hours. Get home fast maneuvers on board the spacecraft, figured out how to navigate using the sun. Power management plan is in work. Maneuver time is approaching. Gets real quiet in this room. Then we hear the crew call out, "Engine start," and the engine's fishtailing. And I say, "Prop, what the hell's going on?" He says, "Give it a few more seconds, flight. Let's just watch it." And we watch that engine settles down, starts thrusting correctly, burns for the next 4.5 minutes, and then we hear shutdown. And then the crew starts their post-burn report, and we immediately recognize our mistake. When we computed the engine trim for the start maneuver, we assumed 2 crewmen would be in the lunar module, 1 crewman would be in the command module. Well, that assumption was wrong, because they had all 3 crowded into the lunar module so they could see what was going on. So from now in mission control, there will be no more assumptions. Well, the maneuver cut a day off the return journey. It also changed our landing point from the Indian Ocean to the South Pacific near Samoa. So we send the aircraft carrier Iwo Jima to the new landing location. Now the only management flight in Apollo 13 begins. I got several people clustered around my console up there. Deke Sleep, and the boss of the astronauts, comes over, leans over, and he says, "Look, I want you to get my crew to sleep. If you then tired, they're going to make a mistake." And about the time I got his input, my boss, Chris Kraft, had come down from the console behind me. He said, "No, you ought to get that spacecraft powered down. You're using too much energy." Well, Max Faget had come into the room, who was chief of engineering, and Max says, "Nope, don't listen to those two. What you got to do is you got to restore thermal balance to the spacecraft." Well, that was the direction we were already going, because we'd been tracking temperatures for the previous 24 hours. And the sun side of the spacecraft temperature was at plus 150. On the dark side, it was minus 180. So we had a 330-degree temperature difference with all the spacecraft. And everything on the dark side was freezing up rock solid. Now, the only source of energy we have is the sun. So what we must do is invent a barbecue-type maneuver to spin the spacecraft perfectly on its axis so the sun can heat all sides. And we've never done this before using the lunar module thrusters. because they're not favorably located. They're in between two spacecraft, so you can't really get any force and moments out of them. And this is probably one of the finest examples of teamwork I've ever seen. Clustered around my console up there are the designers of the autopilot system down there. I'm sitting at the console, several of my controllers around the back. We got several folks from headquarters. And for about an hour's period of time, we're literally conducting a physics experiment in space. We're trying to figure out which thruster, or sets of thrusters, or combinations of thrusters fired in which direction for how long will set up the spin-up condition we need. After about an hour's work, we feel we got all the piece parts, write the sequence down, voice it up to the crew, and it doesn't work. We look back over that procedure. We're convinced the crew must have missed one of the steps, so we tell them to try one more time, and we go through very slowly, and the second time it works like a champ. Now we can fully power down the spacecraft. We bring it down to a level of about 100 watts, which is just enough to operate a small fan, provide power for communications. And we can go off and get some rest because we've been operating over 60 hours continuously on my team by this time. So while we're resting, engineering comes up with the solution to another problem because that crew is about 10 hours from expiring due to carbon dioxide poisoning. In the spacecraft, we basically recycle the oxygen. We remove the carbon dioxide from the crew's breathing by cycling it through a canister that contains lithium hydroxide that removes the CO2. But we only had enough of the cylindrical canisters for 2 people for 2 days in the lunar module. So the carbon dioxide partial pressure is building up to a point where it's becoming toxic and the crew would expire in about 10 hours. Now as engineering, we got plenty of square scrubbers over the dead command module. So engineering comes up with the idea to fabricate an adapter to fit the square scrubber into the round hole using the cardboard cover from the flight plan we had, a big plastic baggie we had on board. We used a sock as a filter, some more cardboard, duct tape, hoses, lash it all together, test it in labs, and it works like a champ. So they come in here, they voice the instructions up to the crew to build not one but 2 of these devices. We put them in series so we'll clean the atmosphere as rapidly as possible. Doggone it, it didn't work. Just-in-time engineering, the crew was less than 5 hours from expiring at that time. This is online. We got 6 hours rest my team, so we come in to find out how things are going on. The return status is not very encouraging. It's getting much colder in the spacecraft than we had expected it to. Our water system is freezing up. So we have the crew transferring water to baggies so they have something to drink and rehydrate the food. The Navy tells me a typhoon is building in the exact landing spot that I'm bringing the spacecraft back to, so they want me to change my landing point. But the problem that really gets my attention, Jerry Bostic at this console walks up to my console, leans over and says, "Flight, I hate to tell you this, we're going to miss the Earth. We must perform an emergency maneuver." Now we have no power, we have no display system, but again, he's figured out how to perform a maneuver. We tell the crew to rotate the spacecraft so they can see the Earth outside the 2 triangular windows in the lunar module. And on each one of these windows is a gunsight type telescope we use for lunar navigation, rendezvous, and docking. And we tell the crew to line the y-axis crosshair on the Earth's terminator, which is a line between daylight and darkness as the Earth is viewed from space. And in that alignment, the engine will be properly positioned to make the maneuver we need. We then say, "Jim, looking through your sighting device with your hand controller, when the engine starts, you keep the Earth from moving up and down. And Fred Hayes, on your side of the spacecraft, with your hand controller, you keep the Earth from moving from left to right." And we tell Swigert to put 14 seconds in his wrist. We're getting ready to enter into the atmosphere. We have to maneuver into an orientation so we can explosively separate these 3 pieces so they will follow different reentry trajectories. But before we do that, we have to evacuate from the lunar module, get into the command module, rapidly and efficiently power it up, initialize computer, close hatch, check orientation, and start blowing the pieces apart. This will turn into a checklist that's about 500 items long. I walk over to the simulator to see how things are going over there, and Ken Mattingly is working the procedures for me. And Ken walks up and says, "I think they're ready to go, but one thing I'd like to do is a final cross-check. I'd like to give them to a crewman who has never seen them and have him go through it a final time." All right, good. That's a good final cross-checking procedure, so we reset the deadline back to a landing minus 18. I wish we had some graphics that show you what these procedures look like. You know, we had no word processors, no nothing, so these are all handwritten. things scratch out an existing checklist, other things scotch taped onto it, etc. And basically this was the quality of the technology at that time. It's about landing minus 18, so we start voicing up the instructions to Jack Spire, the job he has to do in the command module. We work with Jack for about 2 hours. He's got the job, and then we start reading up to Fred Hayes, and unknown to us, Fred Hayes is pretty sick by this time. We had a miscommunication with him. He just didn't understand what we said, and he rationed his water intake. So other people could have water for themselves and also use to cool the spacecraft lunar module systems. So he has now got uncontrollable shivers, dehydrated, bad urinary infection, body temperature is 102 and increasing. But Fredo's the guy that has to do the job in the lunar module, so we work with him until we understand his part of the job. And then we power down to get a few more hours rest before we come in for our final shift, and that's where we are right now, landing minus 8 hours. I always have my controllers go off, get by themselves, totally by themselves, get totally focused upon what their role is, and when they're ready, they come into the control room here, and they give me a green light indicator from the console, which will line the panel up on top of my console. I have an all-green board, and I send my flight surgeon around to see if they're going to need a stimulant to keep them going for the final hours. He's going to interview them. Most of the controllers refuse the stimulant. They're going to do it in black coffee and cigarettes. I put on my white vest, which is my team's trademark since the very early days in space. And I'm so proud of these kids I could croak. I mean, just they're in sharp. They're on top of the job. They're ready to go, and then I get concerned peeking too soon. Don't even have that luxury. Bostic is walking up to my console again, looks up and says, "Flight, we're again off our reentry trajectory. We now have to perform a maneuver, and we got to do it right away." And he gives me the piece of paper with all the maneuver instructions. So now we're going to blow our electrical power profile. We voice the instructions up to the crew to load program 40 on board the lunar module. We provide them the orientation. They perform the maneuver, and we then are really scrambling down here trying to find a few watts power and other things that we can save during the next steps of power down. And it's now time to jettison the damaged spacecraft. And the crew calls off service module jettison, and there's about a 45-second pause. And then they start reporting, "Okay, I've got her. The whole side of the spacecraft's missing all the way to the high gain antenna. The whole side is missing to the base of the engine." And then Hayes says, "Yeah, I've got the engine too. There's nothing but a dark brown streak by the injector." And here in Mission Control, I'm thinking of that decision I made almost 4 days earlier based on nothing but a gut feeling, and I cannot describe to you how intense that feeling was. And many of the controllers in this room have experienced the same thing. There's some point of the mission where you've done absolutely the best you can for your crew on the mission. Then it's time to hand over to higher authority to bring this mission to its ultimate conclusion. We now start powering up the command module. There's water all over inside the spacecraft from condensed moisture, hanging in switches, circuit breakers, globs as big as a silver dollar floating free in the air. And now you can feel the emotional content of this room starting to build, because for the first time in this entire 4-day period, the controllers are starting to sense victory. And all they got to do is hang in there. And the emotional content peaks when we jettison our lunar module, because we speak to it and we say, "Farewell, Aquarius, we thank you. You were one hell of a good ship." And now it's time for me to run my final poll of my controllers. And just as I start pulling the controller to give the go, I'm interrupted. The controller comes to me and says, "Flight, we got to get the route quick. Battery C's failing and we need power for the parachutes." So we voice the instruction to the crew to pull battery C offline, redistribute batteries A and B across the buses so we got powers for the chutes. And now it's real difficult talking in there. And finally the rookie astronaut on board the spacecraft calls down to us and he says, "You know, all of us up here want to thank you guys down there for the great job." And then we get an attaboy from both Lovell and Hayes. And before we can respond, there's a burst of static and they're going to call a flight. We've had loss of signal. We're in blackout. Blackout is the time period where the fire of entry prevents communications to the stage of the space program we were able to nail when it will finish to within a second, and we've never missed. And blackout's an extremely difficult time for every controller because there's only one thought in our mind. We give the crew everything we needed to. Was my data right? From now on, the crew is on their own. And every eye is on the clocks on the wall counting down to 0. And when I finally hit 0, blackout should be over, and I say, okay, Joe, give him a call. Everyone calls out and say, Houston, standing by. There's no response from the crew. Call again and call again. Now it's 1 minute since we should have heard from the crew. And literally every controller is standing in this room. And if you see the picture, it's very graphic. That whole back row, they're standing and looking at the clocks up there, wondering what in the hell went wrong. But in our business, we will never surrender. We keep working. We keep calling. 1 minute and 27 seconds after we should have heard, Ray of Hope, downrange aircraft, calls out our IFR his acquisition signal. And the aircraft carrier reports radar contact. Then they report a sonic boom. And then in mission control, we see this beautiful picture of the spacecraft under the 3 red and white parachutes. And the emotional release of that instant is so intense that literally everyone in this room is standing crying. And you're frankly embarrassed by your loss of composure. You pull yourself together, watch the spacecraft hits the water, stands upright. The Iwo Jima circles, deploys more helicopters. The parajumpers go in the water to bring the crew out. And this crew that had been living in a meat locker, temperatures range from about 35 to 37 degrees for the best part of 4 days, extremely humid, and all they had was a light cotton coverall. But now these guys are in the warmer of the South Pacific, and they're home, and they are alive. Now in our line of work, our job is not over until we hand over responsibility for the crew to the Recovery Task Force commander. And as soon as the crew's feet hit the carrier deck, we start that handover process. And when it is complete, now we start our celebration. By now, we've pre-positioned 700 of the finest cigars we can find. They run from the west coast of the United States all the way to the east coast of the United States. And on national TV, we count down to light up those cigars, and it's probably the sweetest smoke any of us have ever had. Second phase is to back out of a condition we called battle short in those days. When we get into critical mission phase, we have physically blocked power breakers in the building. We lock control room doors so nobody can get in and out. But now we back out of the battle short, and the backroom controllers come in and join us. And those were the real heroes in 13 because they were the ones that gave us the answers we needed them when we needed them. All we did in here was count cadence and assemble the pieces into the proper sequence. The celebration is to pass out an American flag to every controller. And we started this tradition when we set our first spaceflight record as Americans, and we continued it all the way through to the midpoint of the shuttle program. Set that flag, you write your name, you write the mission, you write the landing time, and the job you were doing in mission control. Well, President Nixon came down and visited us down here in Houston. We got some nice attaboys. And then 2 days later, he goes out to island of Hawaii to give the crew very deserved recognition for absolutely spectacular performance under extreme duress. A lot of times I'm asked what was really the key to success in this mission. It was basically the relationship we had with our crew, and this is the same with every crew. It's absolute trust, and without that trust we would have never been able to implement the off-the-wall procedures we were writing up. A few words about my flight directors. We always operated with 4 flight directors. We did this to balance the training load at the beginning as the mission was starting up because it's very irregular and literally the training in here is as grueling and maybe even more grueling than missions in most times. So it's very intense, very extended. Also our shifts are very irregular, some very short, so this gives the idea of moving the team in and out and giving a break at the midpoint of the mission. Most important reason, however, is one team is always designated as a crisis management team. And that happened to be my responsibility for 13. As soon as a problem occurred, it was up to me to get my team out of the shift rotation sequence, address the problem, come up with the solutions, and return to the console only when we had the answers. Glenn Lunny, the black team leader, was the youngest at 32. He came to us as a co-op from University of Detroit, was the first person I ever knew who worked with a computer. So he was the go-to guy to get the answers. I was the oldest of the flight directors, 37. My team color was white. Milton Woodler was maroon, Jerry Griffin gold. The remaining 3 of us were all fighter pilots. We flew the late subsonic and early supersonic aircraft in the 50s, and I believe it was learning to live with the risks of early jet aviation that really allowed us to keep our poise for the very young people we had in the room. Our nation abandoned the moon. Gene Cernan was the last human ever to walk on its surface. And for us, it was a marvelous time to live because we believed in this dream they were given by John F. Kennedy, and we considered ourselves privileged and proud to be part of the brotherhood that formed in the early years of spaceflight. And we thanked our country every day they gave us a chance to participate in this great adventure. So this is the story of Mission Control, story of Apollo 13, but it's more a story of a group of young people just like yourselves, maybe a couple of years, and a team that truly believes that in our line of work, failure is not an option. Thank you very much. How about that? We're all through. Jim, I'll tell you a couple war stories. You know, you saw this thing about the vests in the movie. Well, that was absolutely true. We have 6 kids, 5 girls. So my wife was real good with a needle and thread. But when I was flying, she made me some of the most sporty flying scarves. For a fighter pilot, basically you got to have your scarf. And that basically, you flash it. It's sort of a competition between pilots. It's the coolest. Well, the wife would make these scarves, and basically the other pilots would see it, so they'd say, would you have your wife make for them? So pretty soon she started making scarves, each one different for the pilots I flew with. So when it came time to fly my first mission, she said, you know, you need some kind of a team identifier. Your team color is white. Why don't I make you a vest? Because at that time, everybody wore 3-piece suits. I mean, every male wore vests in here. So she made a vest, and I came in for my first launch, and I hung it right behind the console there. It was in a plastic clothes bag. And at launch minus 9 minutes, you generally go through a countdown hold. It's a collective guts check. Do we really want to launch this mission? So it's first opportunity for a restroom break. I'm going to be the last one for a long time. So everybody rushes out of this room, and I'm up there getting ready to do my go-no-go, and I reach over, pull that vest out, put it on. The team comes in the room, and they absolutely can't believe they thought I really lost it. And next to me at the assistant flight director, a guy by the name of Dutch Van Ehrenfried makes a call down to our ground controller down there. And we used to have a television camera in that corner, one in that corner, and one right back there. You can see that one there. And all of a sudden, these guys all zoom in on me. And they throw a switch, and I am on every television in this room, out in the press corps, up in Washington, right on down the line. So that was the introduction. My wife made about 40-some vests. Probably my favorite one was one she made for Gemini 9, because that was a basket case mission. Everything's falling apart and always keep coming together. Night before the entry shift, I go home and I asked my wife, I had no idea, would you make me a celebration vest for the end of mission? I said, I don't have any fabric. So I go up, and I was sort of disappointed, went upstairs, and get up in the morning, and I got a beautiful vest. I mean, it is spectacular. It's gold and silver brocade and white silks. What happened, when I come back from Korea, I brought her one of these beautiful robes, and she cut the whole bottom of that thing off and turned that into a vest, which is pretty cool. For those of you who, it was over at the George Bush Library there for about a couple of years ago. And that was one of the favorite. That's one of the real fancy ones. We used them for Girl Scout raffles. So they'd go and they'd get $10, $15 for whatever they're getting for the Girl Scouts. And they got rid of a bunch of them that way. And then probably about 5 years before the movie, I cleaned my closet, got rid of about another 10 or 12 that didn't have any particular symbolism for me. And then the movie came along. And Hollywood needed a copy of the vest, but they couldn't they wouldn't ship it until it was appraised. So I had to find somebody to appraise these vests that were just been hanging in the closet for 20-some years. And they got appraised at $15,000 each. So we managed to ship that out there, and then I thought about all the money that went in the rag bag, everything else. Apollo 13 vest, if you get up to Smithsonian, is up in the Smithsonian right now. I was a much trimmer individual those days. I used to smoke and do everything else. Right now, I get there. Because the day we were going down to the surface of the moon, I really had all the hopes and dreams of the entire planet. It's whether we're going to win the Cold War or not. The work of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of dollars, the challenge put out by Kennedy. And, you know, in this room, this was just another mission. This is sort of a special mission, but it was only after it was all over that we really appreciated the impact that we had in there. And from my standpoint, I began to appreciate the impact of all the people